All right, hi. I'm a lot shorter than I think this podium was designed for, so I'm sorry if you can't see me. I'll try to move around and stuff. Also, if you can't hear me, let me know and I'll, whoa, okay. I'll try not to make that awful microphone noise. All right, so I'm going to be doing a presentation on what we're calling Chernoff Zombies. Chernoff Zombies are a riff on Chernoff face mapping, using zombies, in this case, to show the gaps and uncertainties in our data set. It's also a riff on a tendency in human geography to develop and mobilize these sort of monstrous metaphors. So Cindy Katz does this really well when she's describing capitalism as a sort of vagabond that is a marauding and a highly mobile villain kind of wreaking havoc across the globe. So these are zombies, not simply kind of erasures or transparency masks that we're applying to our maps. So we're trying to evoke something that's kind of monstrous and preying on, passively in a lot of ways, preying on our data set. And this is a collaborative project. A lot of the other folks who have supported and participated in this are here. So feel free to talk to any of us about it. So what I'm going to do is do kind of a brief history of Chernoff face mapping. Might be familiar to some of y'all. Please come and talk to me if you want to talk more about it. I'm going to talk about some of its critiques. It's a highly criticized mapping strategy, but one I think we can still work with. And there's going to be a mapping exercise or a face-making exercise. There's a prize for that. I'll get to it. Then we're going to talk about our project of mapping the transnational hazardous waste trade, first using Chernoff faces, and then Chernoff zombies. I'd welcome feedback on anything. Some things I'd be especially interested in are issues of design in terms of tone and in terms of what's more easily readable. Zombies, again, non-traditional. And then audience, who does this speak to and who can this speak to? All right, so Chernoff faces were developed by Herman Chernoff, who is a statistician and writing in the 1970s. And Chernoff faces are premised on people being especially good at recognizing emotion, finding faces and things. There's a concept called pareidolia, in which we see a random doodle and it looks like a face. And so Herman Chernoff had this idea that he could use faces for data exploration, not for mapping, not for socioeconomic or human-centric data, but for fossils specifically. So he found, as you can see kind of on the right, he found, I think, 26 different variables that you could make out of a face and use to explore, in this case, the fossil data set. Since then, they've taken off in things like statistics and things like environmental policy and things like business, where people have used Chernoff faces to map volatile organic carbons, the map on the left, the map in the middle, public utilities, and the map on the right, environmental policy uncertainty. Another early example that I want to highlight calls for asymmetrical faces, and that's to enable the visualization of more variables. And the one on the left is about weather and pollution in different cities, so kind of getting closer to mapping, but not sure enough maps yet. And then on the right, to talk about real versus forged money. And you're supposed to be able to tell from those faces which symbolize the real money versus the forged money. If anyone can, it's a fun game. I can't. So one of the earliest Chernoff maps was made by Turner in 1977. It is... People have praised it for being emotionally more evocative than the more complex original Chernoff faces that tried to do these 20-something variables. So this one just has 4 different variables, and it's about people. So it's emotionally evocative in that way. There's that connection. Another early one that I want to highlight was made by Kabeloff, who wanted to add detail to faces to make them more readable, and holding some features constant in each of the symbols, so that there would be some consistency. They would look more like faces rather than things that were made in originally Fortran, now more frequently R or Stata. There's a pseudo-Chernoff face map that was made by Montello in 2005, and their objective was to show just one variable, but use a face and that ability to read facial expressions for that. And then in 2011, Nunez has been doing a collaborative work in Hungary and Argentina and wanted to use Chernoff faces because his argument was that kids will be more interested because there are faces in it. I think that's a wonderful argument. I also think people who are grown-ups might also be interested in faces. All right, so I want to get into some of the critiques of Chernoff faces. And Danny Dorling puts this really well, I think, when he says, Chernoff faces are contentious for the very reason that they are seen as so useful. People's reactions to faces are much stronger than to more neutral objects, which are claimed to depict the information more objectively. Visualization at a higher level is all about engaging our imaginations and our emotions. All right, and so I'm going to kind of summarize the critiques of Chernoff faces by saying, the first major one is I think we should be deliberate about whether we use faces for mapping, as opposed to another kind of multivariate map or a series of single variable maps. This has been said by cartographers in a bunch of ways, but you can also find it in cartoons. Carl the Llama, Roth face is just gross. And another kind of part of that argument is that kind of not everything should be symbolized with faces, so Chernoff's original maps were used for fossil data. Faces show emotion. A lot of people have made that argument, so data should speak to the ability of faces to show emotion. I don't think this merits writing off Chernoff faces so much as we should not map everything with Chernoff faces, but they have a place. Other studies have shown that Chernoff faces might not have a significant advantage over other multivariate iconic visualization techniques. That's a quote. Or that they might not be useful for communication as opposed to data exploration. And so, again, I don't think this means they should be written off. I do think it means we should be deliberate about it. All right, so now I want to do an exercise. So everyone pick one of the following emotions, either ecstatic, terrified, or disgusted. Eric, who's a collaborator on this project, is going to be the judge of who makes the best face, and the winner gets a prize of this hazardous waste candy that we picked up in a gas station on the way here. Interestingly enough, it's distributed in Mississauga, Ontario, which is a major site of hazardous waste imports and exports. So you have one of your emotions in your head. Turn to the person next to you or behind you or nearest to you. Make that face at them. Eric is going to judge the best face. All right. Raise your hand if you could tell which emotion the person had chose. Raise your hand if you think you could tell which emotion the person had chose. All right, how could you tell? What about the face? What about the face made it obvious? Anyone? What about someone's face, the expression made it obvious? Yeah. So something about like the mouth and like, Yeah. What else? Can you, louder? Yeah, so what about the eyes? And was there one more? I was just going to say eyebrow. Yeah, all right, so that's exactly the second critique. So we should be careful how we use faces. I'll get into issues with stereotyping in a minute, but some facial features show emotion more than others, and y'all picked up on the exact ones that people have talked about a lot. So the mouth area, and then in the eyes. So cartoonist Ivan Brunetti in the figure on the left talks about how eyebrows can be so emotionally evocative, and so those faces are all the exact same except for the eyebrows. And so that's one of the major critiques of Chernoff face mapping. Like, we should be careful how we use faces. Maybe all of the variations that Chernoff originally did in the jawline are not super relevant for map reading. And then we also want to avoid stereotyping. So the Chernoff map has been critiqued because, for a few reasons. On the one hand, it's been critiqued for stereotyping about race, in that he maps more people of color through making them more brown, which excludes the fact that a lot of people of color are not brown. And then he also made this choice where he implied that people who are less affluent are skinnier, have these narrower faces, which overlooks issues with obesity among the poor due to things like food deserts, due to things like issues of access and privilege. All right, so those are some of the critiques. We're trying to be mindful of them as we're making our maps. And so now I'm going to get into our project of mapping the transnational hazardous waste trade. So our group did a Freedom of Information Act request to the US EPA to receive documentation of all of the US imports and exports of hazardous waste from Canada and Mexico from 2007 to 2012. We're getting more currently. And then we pulled a lot of different attributes from them. I'll get into them when we get into the maps. But in general, if you want to learn more about the project and what we have mapped, you can go to our website. Hazmat Mapper is the interactive map that Eric has pulled together. He'll be presenting later, although not on that. And a lot of the other static maps and stories we've pulled. All right, so originally, we just made a Chernoff face map of this, showing a few of the variables that we'd pulled from the data initially. It does include demographic information, so it's about that socioeconomic data. And we're attempting to avoid things like the issues of racial stereotyping by using shades of blue to indicate percent non-white populations. And we're also trying to avoid the androcentrism of Chernoff face maps by making one that is maybe more female-looking. And one of the things that stuck out to me after making this map later on was the mouths. And so I had chosen to symbolize how the waste was being processed with the mouth. And so recycling had a kind of like basic slanty face of like, it's not the best solution, but maybe. And then if it was being disposed of, sad face. But then if we didn't know, if we didn't have data there, there was no mouth. And so I thought that was I just thought that was really striking. We didn't do any kind of study on that. But the lack of the mouth was really jarring. So we started looking at what are the gaps in the data. There are crossed out numbers. There are difficult to read parts, some of which are due to poorly scanned manifests from the EPA, some of which are due simply to people's handwriting, some of which are due to people somewhere along the transaction not filling something out, some of which are due to someone writing in, this is what we think we're sending, and someone crossing it out and writing, no, this is what I received. So a lot of different gaps and uncertainties in the data set. All right, so Chernoff Zombies, the objective is to, one, productively respond to some of the critiques of Chernoff faces. We're using data that impacts people. We're trying to pay attention to what's been called the emergent interactions of the different visual variables in faces. So if you have eyes looking in a certain way and a mouth looking in another, those two might not interact in the way that you expect. And then we also don't want to stereotype in terms of people and then also in terms of kind of the legacy of Chernoff faces. We also want to demonstrate that presence versus absence can be used as a visual variable on Chernoff zombies or Chernoff faces. And then we want to visualize some of the uncertainties about our hazardous waste import data set. Some of the challenges have been first data wrangling. I can get into that. Y'all probably have a sense of what that means, dealing with this giant data set. And then issues of trust versus aesthetics. So now that we're making these face maps, these zombie maps, what kind of tone is that going to have, and how are we going to be able to trust it? And we want to show that we can't trust the data in certain ways. So that's sort of okay, but it's something to work with. Issues of audience, who is this for? I've been speculating on that, and I have some ideas, but it's an open question. And then just kind of along the way, design issues. I was working on this, and partway through I was like, wow, my zombies look like Weird Al. This is no good. So that was a kind of fun problem. All right, so this is the Chernoff Zombies map of the unknowns in our hazardous landscape. We tried to use only certain visual variables that are known to be expressive in humans, things like the eyes and mouths again. And then ones that seems like they would be expressive in zombies, so things like scars, gashes, gauntness of face. There are a lot of other possibilities. And we're also drawing on what Kabalov described as holding certain variables constant. So they have pretty much the same hair, the same color, the same size. In this case, I'm kind of attempting to be gender neutral, and I'm curious how folks are gendering these faces. And I'm going to break down the data a little bit more in the next 2 slides, break down the variables. But I want to first call out that we did do some simplification in that what was unknown we defined as something that was either not filled in or something that was illegible. So couldn't read their handwriting or someone just didn't fill it in. That both counts as unknown. All right, so these are the individual variables. So you can think of that in contrast to the previous slide, and I'll come back to the zombies one after. So First, what is the waste? There are two different codes for describing what the waste is. One is by the EPA, the other one is from the United Nations. In addition to presence and absence, for the United Nations codes, one of the most common ones was UN 3077, which is specified as unspecified. So it's hazardous waste solid, not otherwise specified. So it's basically saying, we sent some hazardous waste, not what it is. How much we measured or we mapped in terms of quantity, whether or not there's a discrepancy between the amount sent and the amount received, and then in terms of units, were there units present? How dangerous is the waste? The Department of Transportation has a variety of characteristics about the material to determine how dangerous it is. Was that characteristic present or not? And then how is it processed? There's another beyond presence versus absence feature that we're mapping here, which is H141, which is just simply it's transferred. We got the waste, we did not recycle it, we did not try to extract metals from it, we did not incinerate it, we just sent it somewhere else. All right, and so we, again, use things like eyes and eyebrows to symbolize what is the waste. We used scars to symbolize that packing group, how dangerous is it. And then I got to have this really fun conversation in which I was like, well, my maps are fat positive because I used this gauntness to symbolize whether or not there's a discrepancy in the waste. Why wouldn't the maps be fat positive? They only care about brains. All right, and so this is our map. Thank you to all of these institutions for supporting this work, both financially and in terms of feedback and in terms of community. We use Project Linework, which is a way of mapping data, or a way of providing different kinds of line work for your base map. I used Elmer Casual, which is made by a UW-Madison alum, Marty Elmer. So thanks. Any questions?